Good afternoon. I will skip opening jokes and then everything, usual stuff in the beginning, and start right away with several quotes by Serbia's political and church leaders so that we can save time, and because you are, I understand, mostly grad students, so we can have a longer discussion afterward. Okay, so the first quote comes from the former foreign minister of Serbia, Vuk. Serbia should not be forced to decide between European Union membership and Kosovo. Kosovo has deep historical and spiritual meaning for the people of Serbia. In a certain sense, it is our Jerusalem. The next quote is from Alexander Karađorđević, Serbia's heir in throne. His father was a king of Yugoslavia before the World War II. So this is what he said during the NATO bombing of Serbia in 1999. It should not be forgotten that Kosovo is a Serbian Jerusalem and cradle of the Serbian state. The greatest sacred monuments, part of Serbian heritage, are located in Kosovo. The next quote from the current incumbent leader of the supreme authority of the Serbian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Irenej. Quote, "Our first duty as a church is to safeguard our Kosovo, a holy and martyred land, to help our state to defend it from those who wish to seize it." The next was a short clip. We don't have the signal here, but it comes from the current, I think he is still in that capacity, Father Sava Janjić, who is the abbot in the Dečani monastery, one of the monasteries, the major sacred sites, medieval historic monuments in Kosovo. And he is also making the point to a British journalist that Kosovo is a Serbian Jerusalem. Okay, well, there will be more of these quotes. And I have to say right in the beginning that, as Dana mentioned earlier, I started following religious affairs and the ethnic and religious conflict in former Yugoslavia as a journalist in the first half of the 1980s. So it means that I never missed a major church gathering, or including the major nationalistic events and gatherings, mass rallies, leading to the crisis and the war in former Yugoslavia. From, for example, the church jubilees of the Serbian Orthodox Church and the Croatian Catholicism in 1984, over the Jasenovac concentration camp in World War II, to the famous or infamous Milosevic speech at the Gazimestan, Kosovo medieval battlefield in 1989. But I do not remember hearing the phrase Serbian Jerusalem from that time. I don't know, I'm not young anymore, but I think I'm still fresh enough to say that I could not miss that. Well, I focused mostly on church leaders. And these people, I mentioned only two church leaders and then some secular leaders. At that time, if there was anything like that, mentioning Serbian Jerusalem and the 1980s in former Yugoslavia, it was mostly about the Kosovo crisis and also some other Serbo-Croat tensions, and then later on the crisis in Bosnia between the Bosnian Muslims and Croats and the Christians of Bosnia. I really don't think that at the time the idea of Serbian Jerusalem was part of the dominant political discourse. And especially, I don't believe that it is a part of something that we can call Serbian tradition or Serbian history or Serbian national identity. Now, I'm talking about the phrase itself, you know, the idea and the meaning behind it that we can only guess by drawing parallels between Jerusalem and Kosovo as a holy land in the Balkans and Jerusalem in the Middle East. So basically, what I'm going to do, I'm going to skip, by the way, the historical background of the Kosovo controversy. I will just assume because I'm not talking to a general audience, but more specialized, that you know the story about the 14th century, 1389 medieval battle between Turks and the Christian army, including led by the Serbs, and then the Kosovo myth that influenced the way of thinking in the post-communist Yugoslavia, and also the conflict and war and so forth. What I'm going to do now is, well, I believe that there is the history behind the discourse. And it is good for historians to find out what is that history. Also, as a historian, of course, this is a very interesting case for discourse theorists and sociologists and theorists of nationalism. But as a historian, I think I'm trying to be relatively modest. So I will try to argue that this is the Serbian Jerusalem. The meaning of it and the use of it is in fact the case of the invention of tradition. That is the first thing that I'm going to do. Also, I will be looking at the symbols, in this case historical monuments, sacred places, and the idea of constructing that kind of holy land. Why and for what purpose in this under specific circumstances. And then also I will argue that we can talk about a case study in religious nationalism or ethno-religious nationalism in case of the Balkans, where ethnic and religious identities they overlap, they are congruent. Okay, I'm going to skip that. That's what I already said. Okay, now, the first idea that there are sacred historic monuments and shrines in Kosovo that are most important for the Serbs. That is the first, and then that Kosovo is the cradle of the Serbian medieval state, and according to nationalistic discourse, some kind of precedent for the formation of modern Serbia. That thesis or set of theses I would try to argue against. I don't think they are arguably imprecise, to say the least, or perhaps even completely incorrect. Okay, so the first of the medieval monasteries, Serbian Orthodox Church heritage, that was made, put on the UNESCO World Heritage List, is the monastery Studenica, which is not in Kosovo. Let me show you the map. So, these in red letters. These are the most important Serbian monasteries associated with the formation of the Serbian state, of the first Serbia, the medieval Serbia. So this is the cradle of the nation, let's use that phrase, in the Middle Ages, in the 13th century, in the late 12th and the 13th century, these monasteries here, the monastery Žiča, the monastery Studenica, Gradac, especially Mileševa, here, the first grave site of the founder of the Serbian Orthodox Church, Saint Sava, and Sopoćani, and also over there Manasija and Ravanica, and others. So all these monasteries associated with the formation of medieval Serbia and the first Serbian state are not in present-day Kosovo. Here is Kosovo, and unfortunately I don't have the larger map with the historic Patriarchate of Peć in Kosovo and the Dečani monastery that I mentioned earlier, and the Pristina, present-day capital Kosovo, and the Gezmestan historic battlefield near Pristina, and the Church of Gračanica, memorial church dedicated to the Kosovo battle. All these shrines are indeed in Kosovo, but they are separated by time distance from these monasteries that played a critical role in the formation of Serbian medieval state by more than 100 years. From the coronation of the first Serbian king and the autonomy of the Serbian Orthodox Church in 1219 to the establishment of the Patriarchate at Peć in Kosovo, there is time distance of more than 100 years. There is also the distance in spatial distance, more than 350 kilometers, which is for medieval times a lot of distance. And then, perhaps the most importantly, there is the most important Serbian religious cult, which is Saint Sava, one of the Nemanjić dynasty, the founders of the medieval Serbian state. And Saint Sava, the first archbishop of the Serbian Orthodox Church, is not just one of many saints of the Serbian Orthodox Church. And Serbian Orthodox Church, you can quote Eric Hobsbawm, that famous sentence in Nations of Nationalism, Serbian Church canonized most of its kings. Most of them, not all of them. It's important to mention some of them, especially one of them, they did not canonize. So the Saint Sava is not one of the cults. He is the single most important cult of the Serbian Orthodox Church. Why is he important? Because he founded an autonomous Orthodox Church, and according to some Serbian theologians, and I'm going to quote the most notorious among them and one of the conservatives, but I will not start his with arguing, perhaps even mentioning about his writings about Hitler in the 1930s, please, because there's totally different story. Okay, according to Velminovic, Saint Sava established an ideology of Serbian autonomous, independent people's church, so to speak. I don't know how to say that. And that is what is considered most important for the Serbs, having an autonomous spirit. For understanding the conflict in the Balkans is the Serbs versus the Croats, not at this point Albanians of Kosovo and the Muslims of Bosnia. So Serbs versus Croats, I'll get to that later. So the Croats as Catholics and members of Catholicism and little one of small nations of the Balkans, totally devoted to the popes, to the Roman Catholic Church, versus the Serbs, which from the 13th century, thanks to Saint Sava, cherish as the greatest ideal autonomy, independence, independent church. By contrast to Saint Sava, who probably never visited Kosovo, there is the cult that dominated the discourse of the 1980s and the 90s, which is the cult of Prince Lazar, a hero of the Kosovo battle and martyr, canonized by the church and then commemorated as somebody who sacrificed himself in order to make possible for nation later on for national rebirth and so forth. Now I'm using this nationalistic discourse. Saint Sava versus Lazar. Lazar is a warrior. That's how he is remembered, commemorated. He's a man of war and heroic death. The Kosovo myth is a story about heroism and war. But the story about Saint Sava and foundation of medieval Serbia is a story about skilled, clever statesmanship. Saint Sava is portrayed and commemorated in church liturgy as a diplomat, as a smart leader who obtained church independence from Constantinople, from the Byzantine Church, thanks to his diplomatic skills, without use of force, mediating. He's a peacemaker, mediating dynastic tensions. Completely two different saintly cults: a man of peace and a diplomat, and a man of war. Now you can see for yourself why Lazar dominated the 1980s and the 1990s, but not Saint Sava. Although Lazar is not on a par with Saint Sava regarding theologically speaking, St. Sava is by far the most important Serbian religious cult. There is another church leader that the Serbian church did not canonize, which is King Dušan, Dušan the Mighty, founder of the medieval Serbian Empire. He was the one who established the patriarchate at Kosovo, a patriarchate at Peć. And then Kosovo is associated with the Dušan Empire and the Ottoman Empire, because it obtained a certain autonomy under Ottoman rule, but not with the cradle of the nation, not with the original Serbian state. Okay, I'm also going to skip the story about the Kosovo myth and say something about the use of historic monuments, especially in Kosovo, but also elsewhere, by the Serbian state in the 19th century and the early 20th century for shaping the state, for drawing borders. Okay? So, for example, at the Congress of Berlin, and especially after the Balkan Wars in 1913 at the London Conference, these international gatherings where the borders of modern Serbia were decided and drawn, they allegedly took into consideration these landmarks, monasteries, especially monasteries in Kosovo, because Serbia was at the time trying to regain and incorporate Kosovo in the modern Serbian state. So the practice of using these monasteries as boundary markers is well established in Serbian nationalism. Now, we arrived to the 1980s. Okay, most important for understanding the Balkans. Yeah, it's good to know something about the Middle Ages, but I think the 1980s, that's pretty much 1990s, 1980s. Okay, so again, two quotes from colleagues, Serbian scholars. Jasan Dragović is also a British Serbian political scientist. Quote, Kosovo allowed the Serbian nationalist intelligentsia to adopt the role of guardians of both national and universal values, the vision of Kosovo as the Serbian Jerusalem, a holy land of an inestimable importance to national identity. And then perhaps even more important, I will quote him later on again, a sociologist, Canadian Serbian sociologist Marko Živković. He wrote about what he called the Jewish trope. Živković is important because he is actually saying that it is not the analogy, Serbian Jerusalem, it is not primarily, its purpose is not to liken the Jerusalem in the Middle East with Kosovo as some kind of holy land, but in fact to make Serbs sharing the historic faith with the Jews. So by saying that Kosovo is like Jerusalem, it also involves thinking that the Serbs are like Jews. Why? The Jewish trope, says Živković, was one of the most important of the elements of Serbian national narratives, especially in linking the central Serbian myth of Kosovo to the more recent cycle of narratives that focus on the Ustašite genocide against Serbs during the Second World War. And that's what I'm arguing all the time and been arguing for a while. Only Serbs and Croats could establish Yugoslavia or destroy Yugoslavia. I think that the Albanians and the Bosnian Muslims, they could not cause such a war and destroy Yugoslavia. There must be something that relates to the World War II genocide in the independent state Croatia controversy and the Serbo-Croat relations. Okay, so to make story shorter, the person who allegedly invented this Serbian Jerusalem discourse is the Serbian writer Vuk Drašković. And here I have the brief clip where he, on a TV talk show, takes the credit. I was one who invented the Serbian Jerusalem. And even everybody, really? That was you? Yes. So he, in 1985, he wrote a letter to National Writers Association of Israel to inform the Israeli writers about this shared fate of Serbs and Jews as the peoples who suffered more than anybody else in the 20th century. Later on, some of Serb nationalists within another group, which is the Armenians. And after the German parliament passed a resolution about the Armenian genocide, now it is very recently they are talking about Serbian church leaders and nationalists. Nobody suffered so much as Serbs, Armenians, and Jews. Drašković is talking about the Jewish Babylonian captivity comparable to the Serbian life of Serbia under Ottoman rule. Kosovo, says Drašković, is the center of the Serbian Empire, therefore a Serbian Jerusalem. The great migration of Serbs from Kosovo in 1690 is like the Jewish exodus. Today, says Drašković, Serbs and Jews share the same tragic fate as victims of Nazi fascism and Islamic extremism. So, in this case, in addition to, then he also says Serbs are the 13th lost and most ill-fated tribe of Israel, Jeremiah's lamentation, who forgets Kosovo, and something happens to his right hand, I don't know. What I would say that this metaphor is not drawing from a tradition from the Kosovo battle and later on in the Serbia. It was invented in the 1980s for the purpose of managing, so to speak, for serving the Serbian nationalist movement that wanted to restructure Yugoslavia. They were thinking about, after Yugoslavia, redrawing borders, preserving land. So basically placing the blame on the Croats while fighting with them over Bosnia for World War II and on Albanians and Bosnian Muslims as allegedly importing Islamic extremism and terrorism. There is one or two precedents when there is some mentioning of something similar like Serbian Jerusalem. For example, the Serbian Patriarch Dimitrije Pavlović, he was the first patriarch in the unified Yugoslavia. He proposed that the island of Corfu in Greece, where Serbian army, after something called Serbian Golgotha in World War I, where Serbia lost 1/3 of his male population of the military age, when his army was decimated after the Austrian and German joint offensive in 1915. So they retreated to the island of Corfu, and they recovered and then returned to the front. So the island of Corfu, which is kind of mythical place, and there is the famous song, Tamo Daleko, how should I translate that? Which is, far away. So the Patriarch thought, the island of Corfu will be our Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a place of pilgrimage, and that will be a destination for young Serbs and new generation to remember the Serbian Golgotha. He's not talking about the Kosovo battle of the 14th century, talking about World War I. Another mentioning of Serbian Jerusalem took place in World War II by Nazi collaborator Milan Nedić, general, Serbian Peten. So Nedić in the Daily Politica, now quote, "Today, as dark clouds gather in the skies of Europe, we Serbs are yet again returning to Kosovo, Serbian Jerusalem, the eternal fount in our vital stamina, to smell the red flowers of the heroes' graves and inhale the fighting spirit of Obilic, the avenger of Kosovo, one of the heroes." As I said earlier, Kosovo is coming from Serbian Jerusalem, and that's not the, like a number of other elements of the Kosovo myth, they are not work of the people. What is work of the people is remembering the fighting spirit. And the most popular heroes of Kosovo are Miloš Obilic, the assassin of the Sultan, the Prince Marko, some kind of Balkan Robin Hood. So it's mostly about war, about, So the expanding the discourse in the 1980s, in 1990s. So Dobrica Ćosić, one of probably the champions of Serbian nationalism, the writer, the Serb is the new Jew at the end of the 20th century. Then a priest, Žarko Gavrilović, Serbs are greatest martyrs of human. I'm going to skip this. So there are also these popular singers, you know. This guy is a Croatian singer. It's pretty much the same thing as Serbian. There is a tune which is better that we don't have signal, so you don't want to hear that. Okay, so in the as the United States, after the NATO intervention, the United States moved towards supporting Albanians and preparing ground for the independent Kosovo. So the Serbian diplomacy, especially when Drašković served as foreign minister and then Vuk Jeremić, they tried to use this idea of Serbian Jerusalem to influence Israel. So Drašković traveled to Israel several times. They appealed to Israel. They want to sensitize the Israeli public opinion about that Serbian Jerusalem and the idea that Serbs and Jews are greatest martyrs of humankind, which kind of Israelis didn't really, but they liked the idea. Of course, they sympathized Serb more than Croats, who actually denied the anti-fascist tradition, and they tried to suppress the anti-fascist tradition, and they tried to say that genocide in World War II did not happen, and when the Jews and the Serbs were almost destroyed in the independent state of Croatia. But there were some sympathies in Israel, but not really the support for the idea of the Serbo-Jewish trope. So there is an Israeli perspective that is trying in the Israeli press. They were cautious about the idea of what they were supporting in Israel is that there should not be secession and proclaiming independent states by pressure from outside. So basically, they were alluding to the role of the United States in the Balkans. When America basically established the Albanian state, and the Albanians immediately built a huge monument to Bill Clinton in the capital city of Kosovo. So Israel, of course, doesn't like the idea of supporting the rights of self-determination of the Palestinians, because they were thinking about, well, today Kosovo and Albanians, they are getting state of their own, so there should be the same policy in Israel with regard to the Palestinians. One more thing. There were a number of articles in Serbian press, but also in Croatian, now that both Serbia and Croatia are turning completely right-wing, hardline, nationalistic. But they love the Israeli army. And both Croatian and Serbian nationalists mutually hateful of each other, right? But they like the Israeli army. They like their army because they want to oppress minorities, like Israeli Palestinians. So in Croatia, they like the Israeli army. That's what we need to do with regards to the remaining Serbs in Croatia, get rid of them completely. And the same thing in Serbia. Oh, our army should be like the Israeli army. That's what we need to do with the Albanians in Kosovo, the majority mostly Muslim people. Interestingly, some church leaders did not like the Serbian analogy idea. For example, Patriarch Pavle. He believes that the only something holy place deserves to be called Serbian Jerusalem is the monastery Mileševo that I mentioned, the original grave of Saint Sava. And then religious scholar Mirko Đorđević, he believes that the cult, the main cult of Saint Sava, teaching Serbs, inspiring Serbs for peacemaking, for diplomacy, for mediating internal conflicts, has been overshadowed by the warrior Prince Lazar and his sacrifice. And by that, Đorđević was arguing that is the purpose of the discourse was preparing Serbia for war. I'll skip of course, the use of the Serbian Jerusalem metaphor has been overused, so that by some satiricists ridiculed it. It simply became kind of boring. But this is quite interesting. is that the Serbian government is trying to emulate the Israeli settler movement in the West Bank and the occupied territories. So in March 2016, the government of Serbia's Office for Kosovo Affairs announced plan to relocate in Kosovo 20,000 Serbs from Serbia, earlier expelled by Albanian nationalism, of course, because there is Albanian backlash, to a project for the construction of new settlements in the northern Serb enclaves in Kosovo, but also in ethnically cleansed areas, including traditional Albanian populated south. I mentioned this most recent addition to the discourse by introducing the Armenians. And I also mentioned this, but let me one more time quote the sociologist Živković. So Živković is saying that Serbian national narratives such as Kosovo, World War I, World War II, and the Serbian Jerusalem, and the Jewish trope, the common denominator of all these stories is a theme of eternal victimization. The Jewish trope is one of the most important of these narrative elements, especially in linking the central Serbian myth of Kosovo to the more recent cycle of narratives that focus on the Ustaša genocide against Serbs during the Second World War. Again, I agree with them about this. Kosovo is not the major battlefield in the Balkans or in Europe. It never was. Not in the 14th century. It was on the margins of Europe. Not in the 90s or 80s. The central is the Serbo-Croat conflict. Now, one or two conclusions and I'm done. It's interesting, this Serbian Jerusalem idea belongs to the new discourses of post-communism. When the former communists are adjusting to the new situation by using because they lost their own discourse and they are, of course, they do not voice Marxism anymore or Leninism or anything else, so they need, if they want to stick they preserve their status and position and preserve power, they are now turning into nationalists and using these discourses of religion and myth and so forth. Very interesting. So I'm quoting these two secular former communists that are using this discourse of religion and myth, like Vladimir Putin. So he justifies the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea in predominantly spiritual language, asserting that Crimea has, quote, sacred meaning for Russia, like the Temple Mount for Jews and Muslims. And that Crimea is the spiritual source of the formation of the multifaceted but monolithic Russian nation. It was on this spiritual soil that our ancestors first and forever recognized their nationhood. The same thing about Drašković, I talked about them a lot, but both of them, he was like Putin, he was actually even higher ranked former communist official than Putin. Drašković, the inventor of the Serbian Jerusalem discourse, he was personal secretary to one-time head of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. Now, as I argued, so we have here a case of the invention of tradition, which is okay, let me use the original Hobson Ranger definition. Modern nationalist practices of using ancient material to construct invented tradition of a novel type for quite novel purposes. The new traditions use old materials, invent new language or devices, extend the old symbolic vocabulary beyond established limits. I already explained this. And then one more thing. As you know, there has been a great deal of destruction of historic monuments in the Balkan Wars of the 90s, precisely because not only the Serbian nationalist movement, but also others came to use all these religious landmarks as potential political landmarks, and then trying to redraw boundaries of ethnically cleansed territories. They need to get rid of these archaeological monuments. So I would like to conclude with that we can talk about ethno-religious nationalism, religious nationalism. In this case, as defined by Friedland, religious nationalism is a set of discursive practices by which the territorial identity of a state and the cultural identity of the people whose collective representation claims are constituted as a singular fact. And then to conclude, especially important role of the contested territories that involve certain historic narratives, such as, for example, in the study by Peter van der Veer on the Hindu-Muslim clash in India over that alleged by Hindu birthplace of the Lord Ram, and that used to be used to stand there a historic monument from the 16th century Mughal Empire, a mosque basically. Then Hindu nationalists destroyed, and then Peter van der Veer are a number of things. In India they have only one such a case, but in the Balkans there was hundreds and hundreds of churches and monasteries and libraries and all kinds of historic sites destroyed by various contesting armies, contesting the territories and so forth. So I would conclude with Peter van der Veer. So sacred sites are the physical evidence of the perennial existence of the religious community and by nationalist expansion of the nation. The history of shrines, as told in religious tales and established by archaeological evidence, is the history of the nation.